Okay, so hello and welcome. Yo soy Catita, yo soy fermentista, and today we are with Meredith Leigh. Meredith is in North Carolina. She is an amazing woman. She's a farmer and a butcher and a mother and an author. Her two books are The Ethical Meat Handbook and Pure Charcuterie, and both of these books are in English, and we really need them to be in Spanish because they're such good resources and tools. And so I'm so excited, Meredith, that we can do this interview today and that people in the Spanish-speaking world can get to know you, and eventually we'll get your books published in Spanish because they are just really wonderful. And yeah, so today we're going to talk about meat and meat preservation. And so I think that we should start out by having you introduce yourself and also answer the most fundamental question: is meat bad?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Your energy is super inspiring. And your energy for my books is really flattering. So I appreciate it. So I'm supposed to say who I am and whether meat's bad. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm Meredith. I'm a normal person, just like everybody, who has to feed my family and make lots of choices every single day about what to eat and what not to eat, and where to buy it and where not to buy it. And it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And I happen to have some extra information about that process because I was a farmer for a really long time. And being a farmer is a really hard thing to do. And because it was so hard, I was looking, as I was a farmer, into ways to make it easier for myself. And one of the ways that occurred to me was to also become a butcher. Because I was paying a lot of money to the company that was cutting up the meat that I was raising. And then that was less money in my pocket. So I learned how to become a butcher because I felt like it was a business necessity. That's my background. And then I opened a restaurant and a butcher shop in North Carolina, and navigated all the regulations of that and learned how to do it, and then ended up selling out of those businesses because of a divorce, and decided to write my books. And so the reason for my books are to try to explain to people who have to make decisions every single day about what to eat and what not to eat, and where to buy it and where not to buy it, kind of how the system works for the smaller producers. And if we want to favor good food and good meat specifically, what we have to do as food citizens or consumers in order to make that happen. And so that is all based on the premise that no, meat is not bad. It's just about the way that it is produced, and the way that it's consumed. So the argument is, if it has a good life, a good death, a good butcher, and a good cook, then it's good food. It's great for the environment, it's good for people, and it can be produced without a lot of stress and harm to the animals during their lives. And so my work is focused on education across that entire supply chain.
Yeah, I think your work is really remarkable, and that there needs to be more voices talking about meat in terms of health for the planet and health for the body, because you know, if someone is talking about like an exotic smoothie, about it, like this is kind of like very Instagrammable and very accepted in terms of what our society today considers healthy,
Right.
via Instagram. But you know, it's not as glamorous to talk about raising and butchering animals, but it needs to be a part of the conversation. And yeah, I think it's really important, because I think the more disconnected that we get from the earth, we come up with some ideas about what it means to be human and eat like a human that really kind of maybe aren't true. And I think that, you know, especially across Latin America, veganism is just a really popular movement. And I used to be vegan, and I think you did as well. So it's kind of like a stage to pass through. It's almost like a longing of your heart and your soul and your mind to try to figure out, like, how do I live in this world and feed myself and be the best person I can be? But, you know, many of us, for health reasons or for reasons about it, like coming to a deeper understanding about agriculture, we realize that meat is a really necessary part of the picture.
Right. I think that, you know, you bring up so many good points. I think that the whole Instagrammable phenomenon, like certainly meat can be beautiful. And this is one of the reasons why charcuterie becomes like a really nice entry point for talking to people about meat, because they're like, oh, I love looking at that. That's aesthetically pleasing to me. Whereas, you know, an animal being slaughtered is not, you know, pleasing to my eye or whatever. And so therefore I'm not going to look at it. Therefore I'm not going to take part in it. It's uncomfortable. So it doesn't exist, you know, so it taps into a lot of things. Like, yeah, are we just structuring our food system and our belief system around things that are comfortable for us? Number one, like a compelling question. And number two, are we really pretending like our existence is like completely morally undangerous? You know what I mean? Like if slaughter is uncomfortable, so we just avoid the conversation, then what other conversations do we avoid because we have the permission or the privilege to do so? And so I think that, you know, yeah, we can talk about meat with respect to like health and environment and all the reasons that everybody talks about meat, but I think it also has to be talked about in a spiritual context, because there's a lot that's lacking from the cultural and spiritual conversation about like death and morality, and that makes us more comfortable to go into that like really binary territory and that like monoculture of thought that ends up being like, is meat good or is meat bad? Right?
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like years ago, I wrote an article for Elephant Journal that was like, is a veggie diet the only option for a spiritual person? And no, I think it's not. And you know, meat, I think is a part of the human diet, which means it's a part of the diet of someone who's a spiritual person. We all are. So, so I'm grateful for that, for your voice, and now kind of leading us into charcuterie, because it is really beautiful, and it's nice to eat beautiful things. Like, beauty serves a function, and having like a beautiful charcuterie board is very pleasing and beautiful and tasty as well. So maybe let's define charcuterie, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about like different kinds of meat preservations, because there is some confusion and on this channel in particular, we talk about fermented foods a lot, and a lot of people have questions about, well, are all of these, are cured meats fermented meats, or some cured meats fermented meats, or vice versa, or, you know, so maybe define charcuterie, and then we'll talk about kind of these different categories of meat preservation.
Sure. Well, charcuterie is, and also, like, to be really clear, I don't want to knock beautiful food. I think it's really important, you know, and a way of honoring earth and life is to, like, make food beautiful, you know. So I didn't mean to
oh, no, not at all.
Yeah, that I don't want to make it sound like I think that whole Instagram thing about beautiful food is empty.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but charcuterie is just, it's an umbrella term. It's a French word for all manner of cured meats via salt, smoke, or dehydration. That kind of covers like the whole gamut of products.
Okay. And so when we talk about like fermented meats, is salami like a fermented meat? I mean, so like, and technically fermentation is, well, it can be a lot of things, but technically a lot of people talk about fermentation as being the transformation of carbohydrates, or the breakdown of carbohydrates, i.e. sugars, into acids. And when we add a little bit of sugar to meat products, and we break down those sugars, then we produce acids that help preserve the meat, and that product can be considered a fermented meat. But are other types of meat considered fermented meats?
You mean within the charcuterie
Sort
of, like, framework? Well, I mean, I think it's, you know, there are charcuterie products that are not fermented meats. For example, sausages considered charcuterie. Cooked pâtés are considered charcuterie. And I think we all know as fermenters that cooked products are not, you know, unless they're given a fermentation phase before being cooked, they're not generally fermented products. So you could look at a whole swath of charcuterie, like certain bolognas or force meats, fresh sausages that are either cooked or smoked at a high temperature right away, or pâtés that are like cooked in a bain-marie or water bath would not be considered fermented products. But there's a huge assortment of products all over the world. Pretty much every culture has an iteration of what we call charcuterie, like either the French traditions or the European traditions, but you can go almost anywhere in the world and there's an equivalent preparation to some of the main and most popular, like Italian and French preparations. And a lot of them are fermented foods. And I think in the world of fermentation, which is gaining like a whole new enthusiasm and understanding, meats are often not equated with fermented foods.
Right.
But they are, you know, there are many.
Mm-hmm. So is that like correct to think about it that way? When, like, to salamis, for example, when we add a little bit of sugar, that is definitely a fermented meat product. And
sure.
Yeah, but there's like, do we have to add sugar to all the recipes that would be considered fermented meats?
No, because there's carbohydrates in the meat, right? So the meat itself has more complex sugars in it, and very often sugar is only added to create a more available food source for the fermentative microorganisms.
Right, to reach a higher level of acidity, maybe more quickly and okay, that makes sense. I also wanted to touch on the topic of nitrates and nitrites. Something that we discussed in detail when I took the class with you last month. And I think it's a really important topic to talk about. So maybe we talk about, well, what are nitrates, what are nitrites? And again, I'm asking you like a really like older question, but are they bad?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one of the biggest ones in preservation right now. So sodium nitrite is it's a food additive basically that inhibits botulism. I mean, first and foremost, it also adds pink color. You know, it has some binding reactions that make the meats, you know, the bright pinks that we associate with cured meats. But it's really where it's needed is to inhibit botulism. And so that it creates an environment where botulism cannot and does not want to thrive. And so it forms a protective cyst around its cell. And so that means it can't reproduce. And actually what makes you sick with botulism is not the bacterium itself, it's the spores. It's a toxin produced by the spores that's produced by the bacteria. So if the bacteria has protected itself with this cyst, it can't be killed, but it also can't reproduce and therefore can't produce spores, which produce toxins, and so can't make you sick. And so the presence of the nitrate creates that reaction and therefore renders botulism harmless. And so it is quite necessary, specifically in cured meat products that are never going to be cooked, because in a fermentation process where that pH is dropping, if we know on a assuming your audience are fermenters, they know that botulism likes slightly acidic environments that are devoid of oxygen. So in situations where meats aren't cooked and the pH is dropping, and we know that the interior of that product is devoid of oxygen, then that's a perfect environment for botulism to thrive. And because botulism is naturally occurring, right, and it's in the soil, if we're preserving products that come from the earth, right, that there's a prevalence of botulism in those foods. So what I strive to communicate in my education is why nitrite is necessary, when it might be omitted, and why that matters. Because of regulation, particularly in the United States, and I don't know what this looks like in Latin America, but in the United States, in order to sell a ready-to-eat meat product, you have to include sodium nitrate. It comes in two forms, as you mentioned, which I can talk about in a second, in the preservation of that product. And so the issue with that is that when products that are cured with nitrite are cooked, it produces nitrosamine, which is a known carcinogen. And so naturally there are lots of concerns about it, and it's very controversial. But botulism can also be killed by cooking products above boiling point, you know, for at least 20 minutes. And a lot of meats are cooked at a much higher temperature than boiling point for a lot longer than 20 minutes. And so if you're making cured meats yourself, you have a way more power, basically, over whether you're exposing yourself to nitrosamine or not. Because if you choose to only use the nitrates in products that are uncooked, which is the safest possible application of those, then you have less cause for concern. Right. But if you are, just buying cured meat products off of the shelf, at least in the States, you are absolutely consuming, products with nitrates in them. And if they are cooked hams, so this is particularly concerning for children, right? Because like deli meats, So if we're buying like sliced deli meats for families and kids to put in their lunches and go off to school with, if we're buying commercially produced charcuterie or deli meats for that, or bolognas and stuff, then we're absolutely exposing our kids to nitrosamine. And so a lot of studies that are done about cured meats and you know, cured meats being bad for you, they're based on these products, you know, that are like widely available, and like obviously the research parameters are based around these products, and these products have, you know, requirements placed on them that make, you know, certain harmful additives unavoidable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, you know, it's important to know the distinctions, because the research doesn't necessarily mean that like the processes of preservation are harmful, right? It's just that like the way that humans have designed a system for producing preserved products can be potentially harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's, you know, there's a lot to unpack there.
Right.
What did I miss?
Oh, well, the like nitrate versus nitrite.
Okay. Yeah, so sodium nitrate is a more complex form of nitrogen, basically. So there are two products, sodium nitrite, which is more available, and then sodium nitrite nitrate. And their trade names are cure number 1 and cure number 2. So cure number 1 is sodium nitrite, and it is nitrite that's already ready to go and interact with microorganisms to inhibit, you know, botulism, basically, if that's what we're thinking of as the primary faculty of this ingredient.
Right.
Sodium nitrite nitrate, or cure number 2, is used for products that have a longer curing time, and that way there's a slow release reaction of nitrogen into the equation. So the nitrate breaks down into nitrite, and then the nitrite interacts with the microbes. So cure number 1 is typically used for products that take 30 days or less to preserve, and then cure number 2 is used for products that take 30 days or more.
For the people here that that are listening that don't yet that haven't yet entered into this world of charcuterie at home, that are buying things like bacon or, you know, other meats at the supermarket, would you recommend that they look for something that has, for example, celery powder?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's a lot of debate about this. I mean, some people argue that the most harmful thing about nitrates is actually the dyes that are used to in the synthetic products, not the celery juice products, that are used to distinguish them from table salt. And so there could be an argument there for using natural forms of nitrite, such as celery juice extracts or celery juice powders. But it is important to understand that celery juice extracts and powders are still sodium nitrite. It's just a naturally occurring form of it. So you're not going to avoid the nitrosamine in a cooked product that uses celery juice extract. And so in a lot of ways, those claims, like label claims like nitrate free, when the product uses celery juice, are a little bit misleading, because it's really not nitrate free. It's just free of synthetic nitrates.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense, and you go into it in more detail in your book, but I like how you talk about that. When you do it at home, you get to make decisions that maybe you don't have those decisions if you just buy meat at the supermarket, because you can make decisions about like when is it necessary to use nitrate or nitrite, and when is it that you can leave it out.
Right. And the important thing to highlight there is that education is really necessary, right? Because we don't want people getting botulism, right? Like it's not, you know, I've been accused of like, of maybe being a little bit glib about this subject, and I don't want that to be the case. Like I take it very seriously, and I've had friends who've gotten botulism, and so it's not something I want to like gloss over and make it sound really simple. Like in my classes, in my books, I really try to help people understand the science of it, so that they can make an informed decision, you know. But I also think that there is room within the use of nitrates to sort of give people back a bit of choice, like you said, and empower them to enjoy these foods that are really old and beautiful and indigenous and important for, you know, using animals responsibly without, you know, creating a huge harm to their health, you know? And so that's the opportunity. And if we have the right education that's really open source for people to like really hit that target, that's a win, you know?
Mm-hmm. What do you think is like a good starting point, like a beginner charcuterie maker? You know, should it be, is sausage the gateway drug into the world of charcuterie? Or, but I think a lot of people actually kind of need to go to the butcher and like learn about cuts of meat almost. You know what I mean? We just, I don't know, so many people just like know about chicken breasts and, you know, with the skin off. And so I think it's a long process for someone to get to the point where they're like, okay, I'm going to make salami.
Yeah, I think sausages actually are a bit more advanced. Some people start with sausages, but I don't know if it's very intentional. Okay. You know, I would think a better gateway meat would be like a whole muscle that's salt cured. So bacon is a perfect example. Like most people know that bacon comes from the belly of a hog, right? So go ahead and get yourself a raw, fresh piece of belly. And then you just need really simple principles to salt cure it. And then if you bake it in the oven or smoke it on the smoker, you know, you're producing bacon. And you can do it, and depending on the size of the piece of meat, you can do it in less than, you know, 2 weeks time.
Right.
And you can do it, you know, you can, if you smoke it or cook it at a high temperature, you can do it without nitrate. And so, you know, your very first project out of the gate, or your gateway charcuterie, could be your very own homemade bacon that is completely free of nitrosamine.
I think that's a great gateway because bacon is just so good, you know?
Good.
Yeah, it's so good. And it, like, that's what we talked about before, like enjoying your food and making it beautiful and sharing it with your family, you know, it's just really great. And I think so many people now are so attracted to fermentation or like learning really useful skills, because these are skills that were a part of our being. They, you know, these are like human skills that that our ancestors and their ancestors like knew how to do, and there's kind of this void, I think, in modern people. Yes. This like desire to relearn or remember some of these things that make us human.
Yes, totally agree with everything you said.
Yeah, so it's really empowering, and I do think it's, you know, whether it's like a first batch of sauerkraut or making your own kefir or curing bacon, I just think those are really, really good things to do. And it's great. Even the most urban person can do this.
Yes, totally agree.
You don't have to live on a farm to be able to cure your own meat.
No, and you don't have to be able to butcher.
Yeah.
Either. You know, I mean, it's a bonus if you do learn that, but
yeah,
figure it out and then support somebody else to be a butcher. Great, you know, let's work together.
Yeah. Well, Meredith, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to publish this interview and that more people in the Spanish-speaking world know who you are, because your books are really great resources, and I think really necessary resources. There's a kind of a void in the real food space about meat in depth. So yeah, I really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon, and we will be in touch.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.